Old Mill Cave Incident. In February, a group of spelunkers entered Old Mill Cave in Virginia. The cave was known for challenging passages ranging from large chambers to tight crawls. The group began exploring through the underground system with proper gear. At some point, they took a wrong turn. Instead of following the established route, they found themselves in an unfamiliar area. The wrong turn led them to encounter a tight crawl. This wasn't a horizontal squeeze, but an inverted V-shaped passage. Two rock walls met at an angle at the top, creating a V formation. One member decided to force his way through. He went in head first with arms extended ahead. As he pushed deeper, the passage got progressively tighter. The V-shape forced his legs together and compressed his torso. He reached a point where he couldn't go any further forward. He was stuck, unable to move forward or backward. Trying to back out was even more difficult. His clothing caught on the rough rock and pulled tight around his torso and neck. He barely had enough space to breathe. He was now in a genuinely life-threatening situation. The other members realized their companion was in serious trouble. One member positioned himself at the entrance to assess. The trapped man's clothing was catching on rock and strangling him. A group member squeezed partially into the crawl. He reached the trapped friend's clothing and began undoing buttons and fasteners. Slowly, he managed to undo the clothing. With no clothes restricting him, the trapped man could finally breathe easier, but he was still wedged in the V-shaped passage. He began the slow process of backing out inch by inch. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he emerged from the tight crawl and he was exhausted, bruised, scraped, and completely naked. But he was free and could breathe normally. The group quickly moved away from the dangerous passage. They realized this was not the correct route through Old Mill Cave. The trapped spelunker redressed himself in the cave. The experience had been terrifying and humiliating, but he was grateful to be free and unhurt beyond scrapes and bruises. The group retraced their steps back to the main route. As the sun set, they successfully exited the cave. Sótano de las Golondrinas Incident. In February 2002, a group of Russian base jumpers stood at the edge of Sótano de las Golondrinas in Mexico. The Cave of Swallows had an entrance pit that dropped 1,100 feet straight down. That's taller than the Eiffel Tower. For base jumpers, Golondrinas was the perfect pit. The typical protocol was straightforward. You step off the edge, free fall for 4 to 6 seconds, then deploy your parachute. This gave you 15 to 20 seconds for the chute to fully deploy before reaching bottom. But one Russian jumper wanted to set a record. He wanted the longest delay before opening his parachute. He wanted to fall longer than anyone before. He did his calculations and decided he could push it further. He stepped off the edge. 2 seconds, 3 seconds, 4 seconds passed. This was when most jumpers pulled their ripcords, but he kept falling. 5 seconds, 6 seconds. He was in uncharted territory. 7 seconds, 8 seconds. His hand moved to the ripcord and he pulled. The parachute began its deployment sequence, but he'd already fallen roughly 800 to 900 feet. He was traveling at over 150 miles per hour, and he only had 200 to 300 feet left before impact. The parachute started to inflate and slow his descent, but it wasn't fully deployed yet. The bottom was coming up fast, too fast. His feet hit the bottom of the cave. The impact was brutal. The bones in one leg broke. He went down in a heap with his partially deployed parachute around him. He'd set the record but paid for it with his body. He was in serious trouble with a broken leg and likely internal injuries. The Russian group had brought a motorized winch. They immediately started rigging it, but it took time. His vision started to narrow as shock and blood loss took over. They secured him in a harness and started the winch. Slowly, he was hauled up through 1,100 feet of open air. It took an hour or more. When he reached the surface, they rushed him to a hospital. He was taken to intensive care. Miraculously, he survived and recovered. Jackson Blue Springs Incident. On 4th November 2014, 2 experienced cave divers prepared to explore Jackson Blue Springs in Florida. They had dive propulsion vehicles, multiple breathing tanks, and equipment for deep penetration. The Gold Line was a crucial navigation cord marking the main passage to guide them safely out. At 2,300 feet from the entrance, they reached a section called the Trash Room. Here, the main passage marked by the Gold Line made a sharp left turn. Directly ahead was an alternative route called the Rabbit Hole Bypass. This bypass was rarely used, absent from most maps, and highly technical. During their return journey, they missed the sharp left turn. Instead of following the Gold Line, they continued straight into the bypass without realizing their error. The initial section resembled the main cave with comfortable dimensions. Nothing signaled their mistake immediately, but the rabbit hole's true character revealed itself gradually. The passage began to constrict with walls pressing closer. Their scooters became liabilities in the cramped environment. When they reached a critical restriction, they couldn't fit through with all their equipment. Their attempts to navigate stirred fine sediment. Within moments, clear water transformed into an opaque cloud. Zero visibility surrounded the lead diver while he remained tangled with equipment. His breathing gas supplies continued their steady countdown. His partner, positioned behind, managed to extract himself. With visibility restored, he could assess the situation. The second diver returned to the main line and raced to the surface for help. Underground, the lead diver waited as sediment gradually settled. As clarity returned, he worked backward through the bypass. He located the main passage and its Gold Line, but his breathing gas calculations were concerning. He had consumed more than planned dealing with the emergency. He located an emergency gas cache placed by another diver along the route. The additional supply provided the margin needed waited for safe exit. As he approached the cavern zone where natural light penetrated, he encountered Ed Sorensen. Sorensen was a renowned cave diving rescue specialist who responded to the call. Together, they navigated toward the surface. The second diver returned to provide additional assistance. All three divers emerged from Jackson Blue Springs safely. Bat-Colon Cave Incident. On June 15, 2002, 26-year-old Mark Orr and three friends had traveled to explore Bat-Colon Cave in Florida. All four divers were certified open water divers with basic scuba training. The group had basic scuba gear but not cave diving equipment like redundant air systems. They brought one rope to use as a guideline to follow back to the entrance. The water at the cave entrance was impossibly clear. They descended into the water and the first few minutes were magical. The cave opened into a large chamber with stunning rock formations, but as they moved deeper, the passages became narrower and natural light faded to black. They were now completely dependent on their flashlights to see. Then disaster struck when one diver accidentally kicked the cave floor. A cloud of silt exploded upward like an underwater dust storm. Within seconds, the crystal clear water turned into a brown soup. Visibility dropped to zero where Mark couldn't see his hand in front of his face. Panic set in immediately as Mark couldn't see his fellow divers or the guideline. Mark reached out blindly trying to find the rope or his diving partners. His hands found only rock walls and water. As panic increased, his air consumption skyrocketed as panic drove his breathing rate higher and higher. In panic conditions, a tank could be empty in just 15 minutes. Mark's hands scraped against limestone walls as he searched desperately for the way out. Then Mark remembered passing through a large chamber with an air pocket earlier. With his air gauge approaching zero, Mark made a desperate gamble. He stopped swimming horizontally and instead kicked upward, hoping to find that air pocket. His head broke the surface just as his regulator delivered its last breath of air. Mark gasped in the cave air with his heart pounding hard. He was alive, but his situation was still desperate in the darkness. He was in an air pocket roughly 10 feet wide with a small ledge above water. Mark hauled himself onto the ledge. Now came the worst part, the waiting in absolute darkness. Mark had no idea if his fellow divers had made it out safely. He was alone deep inside an underwater cave with no air supply. Exhausted from the ordeal, Mark fell asleep leaning on the cold ledge. Above ground, Mark's diving partners had managed to escape the cave. They emerged panicked, realizing Mark was still missing, and immediately called for help. Scott Hunsucker, a certified cave diving instructor, received the call about the missing diver. 6 hours after Mark entered the cave, Hunsucker descended into the water. He navigated the cave system with expertise. He carried redundant air systems, multiple powerful lights, and proper guidelines. When Hunsucker reached the large chamber with the air pocket, he surfaced cautiously. There was Mark Orr, alive, leaning on a ledge in his dive gear. Hunsucker gave Mark a spare regulator connected to his redundant air system. Using proper cave diving techniques and following a guideline, Hunsucker led Mark out. Low Birkwith Cave Incident. In 2005, an experienced cave diver entered a remote British cave system to continue exploration work. The exploration had been abandoned 30 years earlier by other divers. Low Birkwith Cave is located in the Yorkshire Dales of England. The cave had been partially explored back in the 1970s. Colin Pryor was an experienced cave diver qualified to take on this challenge. He understood the unique dangers of exploring flooded underground passages. The sections of Low Birkwith that Pryor was diving were low, narrow passages filled with fine silt. In the 1970s, the original divers laid guideline through the passages they explored. When those divers finished, they didn't remove all their guidelines from the cave. Over 30 years, this old line had deteriorated and become loose. It was now floating freely in the flooded passages. Pryor entered the water and began his dive. He was laying his own guideline as he went deeper into the system. He navigated through the tight passages, carefully avoiding stirring up fine silt. As Pryor pushed deeper, he began encountering the old guideline from the 1970s explorations. At first, this wasn't alarming as it confirmed he was following the original route, but Pryor didn't realize how degraded and dangerous this old line had become. Instead of being secure and attached, it had become loose and floating everywhere. As Pryor continued deeper, he encountered more and more of this deteriorated line. It was draped across the route, hanging from the ceiling, and coiled on the floor. In the confined space, it was almost impossible to avoid contact with the old line. As he maneuvered through a tight section, the old guideline wrapped around his equipment. In the limited visibility, Pryor didn't notice it at first, but as he moved forward, the entanglement got worse with every movement. The old line wrapped around more of his equipment, creating complex tangles. Pryor realized he was caught and immediately stopped moving to assess his situation. In cave diving, entanglement is one of the most feared hazards. Pryor reached for his knife to cut away the old guideline wrapped around him, but the old line wasn't just wrapped around one piece of equipment. It was tangled around multiple points on his body and gear, creating a complex web. Every time Pryor cut away one section, he discovered more tangles elsewhere. Pryor realized he was in serious trouble with the entanglement more complex than he thought. His air supply was running lower than it should be for his position. The silt was stirring up from all his movement, reducing visibility to zero. As his air supply continued to drop, Pryor made increasingly desperate decisions. The final minutes of Colin Pryor's life would have been absolutely terrifying. He knew his air was running out and he was still trapped. He knew that time had run out for any chance of reaching safety. As his air supply finally ran out completely, Pryor took his last breaths. Colin Pryor drowned in that low, silty passage in Low Birkwith Cave. Whiting's Neck Cave Incident. On November 17, 1979, 4 experienced spelunkers from the Baltimore Grotto arrived at the Whiting's Neck Cave. Whiting's Neck Cave sits in the Panhandle area of West Virginia. By 1979, it had earned a reputation as an easy, beginner-friendly cave system. Richard Trayer, George Nichols, Mike Lures, and Steve Jensen were all seasoned cave explorers. They had brought along 4 novices getting their first real caving experience. The group entered through the back entrance and made their way to the main feature. The main feature was a 45-foot inclined drop that required proper rope work to descend safely. The Baltimore Grotto members rigged a handline on the left side of the drop. All 8 members of their group went down without incident as planned. Then a second group arrived at the top of the drop and things started going wrong. This second group was led by someone described as a military type A personality. He seemed knowledgeable and projected confidence, convincing about 15 teenagers to follow him. Of these 15 young people, 2 were deaf, adding communication difficulties. The leader of the second group looked at the Baltimore Grotto's handline and rejected it. Instead of using the safe setup, he rigged his own line right in the middle. He placed it directly over a 10-foot section of completely free vertical drop. The Baltimore Grotto members offered to let the second group use their handline twice, but the military-type leader refused both times, convinced his way was better. Then members of the second group started body rappelling down the poorly positioned rope. Steve Jensen and others watched in horror as the group had no idea what they were doing. Jensen yelled for Richard Trayer because someone was going to get seriously hurt or killed. In the next few minutes, the situation went from bad to catastrophic. One deaf girl fell 20 feet down the drop, tumbling and bouncing off the rock face. Miraculously, she wasn't seriously injured. Before anyone could respond, another person fell, dropping 10 feet before hitting the slope. Again, through luck, there were no serious injuries. 2 other members had made it partway down before becoming completely stranded. They had descended to a point where they couldn't continue down or climb back up, terrified and unable to move. The Baltimore Grotto members watched this disaster with horror and anger. The military-type leader had refused help and was now responsible for multiple falls. There were still more people from his group waiting at the top to attempt descent. Someone was going to die if they didn't intervene immediately and forcefully. Steve Jensen and his companions confronted the leader and gave him a direct order. Leave the cave now and take your group with you. It wasn't a suggestion but a command. But first, they had to deal with the 2 people stranded on the rope. The Baltimore Grotto members organized a proper rescue operation. This was exhausting, dangerous work, pulling them up the steep, irregular slope. Through careful coordination and significant effort, they got both people back to the top. Once everyone was accounted for and immediate danger was resolved, the inexperienced group and their overconfident leader were done for the day. They were exiting the cave immediately with no more rope work or exploration.